is a sign of desperation. This attack on Lviv with this intermediate range ballistic missile, not nuclear armed, but certainly nuclear capable, is a sign of desperation, I believe. I believe that he's recognizing desperately that he's not winning on the battlefield. He's not winning in Donbas. He's got to do something else, and doing these kinds, making these kinds of attacks and these kinds of actions demonstrates his dilemma.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day, I think it's 1,420 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking to Ambassador William B. Taylor. Now, Ambassador Taylor is a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, and prior to the Atlantic Council, he was Vice President, Europe and Russia at the US Institute of Peace. And that, I think, was from 2006 to 2009. And he also served as US Ambassador to Ukraine and as the Chargé d'Affaires from 2019 to 2020 in the US Embassy in Kyiv. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Frontline.
Philip, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, there's lots going on in Ukraine, but it's not hitting the headlines at the minute. So, the biggest thing I think that's come out recently is Vladimir Putin unequivocally rejecting the latest round of potential negotiations that President Trump has put an awful lot of effort into with Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and the rest of his team, and with all the European leaders and with President Zelenskyy. Do you think this is just Putin posturing again to try and gain more leverage, or do you think the Kremlin has fundamentally decided that victory in the battlefield is the only answer?
Philip, I think the Russians are not serious about negotiations. I think that they have never been serious about negotiations. Indeed, as you have reported, President Putin has made it very clear what he's after in Ukraine. I mean, he's not after this piece of territory or that. He's after Ukraine. He doesn't think Ukraine exists or ought to exist. So he wants to destroy, absorb, eliminate Ukraine. So no, he's not interested in negotiation unless he can get from negotiation what he can't get so far on the battlefield.
So why do you think it is that President Trump or President Trump's team seems to keep giving so much extra rope to Vladimir Putin's team? And do you think President Trump has got to the point now where he's genuinely fed up with Putin, or are we going to see more flexibility given to the Russian side whilst more pressures put on Europe and on Ukraine?
Well, Philip, you're exactly right. This has changed over time. We remember episodes in the past year where President Trump almost clearly was on the side of the Russians. But I would say that over the last year, he has begun to recognize, President Trump has begun to recognize that Trump's not his buddy. President Putin is not a friend of President Trump and is not going to do him any favors. And indeed, even worse than that, is playing him, is almost playing him for a fool by stringing him out. And again, Putin has no intention of negotiating, even though he tried to indicate that to Steve Witkoff, Trump's special advisor, which got Putin a meeting or two, a phone call or two, that again seemed to destroy any opportunities for Trump to continue to go in the direction of Ukraine. So will it continue? Right now, it looks like President Trump is irritated with Putin. President Trump does seem to understand that Putin has been stringing him along, tapping him along, as President Trump famously said. So we'll see if that continues. But that's kind of the current direction.
Do you think one of the indicators is the way that the U.S. Coast Guard, backed up by special forces, went and took over the Bella 1 that was renamed the Mariana, the big oil tanker that went from Guyanese registered to Russian registered, sort of mid-Atlantic. Was that used to send a very clear message to Vladimir Putin, given reports that the Russians had sent a submarine and potentially other escort vessels to try and protect it in the Atlantic?
I think you're right, Philip. A strong calling of bluff. President Trump called President Putin's bluff on that. And it turned out it was a bluff. And President Trump took strong action. He's taken a couple of strong actions in the past couple of weeks. And again, together with this irritation at Putin. It's an indication that that President Trump is going to continue to push for a ceasefire, continue to push to end this war, but is going to be putting pressure, I believe, on Putin to get there.
Do you think President Trump has recognized that President Zelenskyy has given an awful lot of concessions in the negotiations he's done with Steve Witkoff and with the rest of the American team? The Europeans have backed those concessions, but Vladimir Putin has given nothing. What do you think is going to happen next?
I think it'll be very clear when Putin again says no, as he has been saying, and in my view, will continue to say no to these agreements. As you indicated, President Zelenskyy and his team have come to an agreement with the Americans, Witkoff and that team, together with, reinforced by the Europeans. They're all on this 20-point plan that appears to be agreed among those three participants, but no indication that the Russians are going to be there. So what happens then? What happens then is pressure on Putin. Putin has to be convinced that he cannot win on the battlefield. As we were just talking, he thinks he can wait us out. He thinks he can wait the Ukrainians out and continue to bash them during the winter, their energy systems. The Ukrainians are tough. Philip, you've seen this. We've seen this. The Ukrainians are tired. They're bludgeoned. They're cold. They're in the dark. They're not giving up. Putin is not going to break them. And if the Europeans continue to support the Ukrainians, and if the Americans continue to support, if we Americans continue, then Putin will have to realize that he can't win on the battlefield and will have to come to the table.
But on the front line, we've seen the Ukrainians are suffering; they're tired, but the Russians are probably more tired. We've seen the Ukrainians recapture Kupiansk. We've seen the Russians fail to close the edges of the cauldron around Pokrovsk, and actually the Ukrainians are having some success in pushing the Russians back a little bit in Pokrovsk. We've seen one or two Russian advances, but we're talking a few hundred yards here and there in other parts of the front line where the Ukrainians have been pushing them back in other villages quite hard. Do you think the Russians are on the cusp of maybe not losing at the tactical side on the front line, but certainly it becoming even more difficult and more uncomfortable for them?
I do. All of what you say is exactly true. They've been trying for Pokrovsk for nearly 2 years. And they said they had it and they don't. They said they had Kupiansk and they didn't. And President Zelenskyy shows up in Kupiansk after. So the Ukrainians have shown to be very tough tactically, strategically, operationally. They're doing great work of holding off the Russians for the benefit, obviously, of Ukraine, but also for Europe. I do think that the support for Ukraine will demonstrate and indicate and finally convince the Russians that this grind, this expensive, horrible, bloody grind, is not worth it. They're not going to break through. They're not able to mass armor or any kind of forces in order to achieve a breakthrough because the Ukrainians can see everything they're doing on the other side of the line. And it is also true that the Russians can see everything the Ukrainians are doing on their side of the line. So there's not going to be a breakthrough. And when Putin realizes that he can't win on the battlefield, he'll have to take another route.
But Putin's response has been suggesting that the Ukrainians attacked his own house with drones. And then whenever the CIA called that out as a bluff, he uses the Oreshnik medium-range ballistic missile against Lviv, targeting primarily a civilian area of Lviv. Do you think this is a sign that Vladimir Putin actually is really quite worried because he's doing almost irrational acts, knowing full well that they can be disproved or shown that it's an overreaction to anything that's going on the battlefield?
It's a good point. He had to know that this was not an attack on his residence. He had to know that this would be revealed by the technical capabilities of the United States and others. He would have to know that this would be seen as a false flag, and yet he continued to do that. He continued to say it. So it is a sign of desperation. This attack on Lviv with this intermediate range ballistic missile, not nuclear armed, but certainly nuclear capable, is a sign of desperation, I believe. I believe that he's recognizing desperately that he's not winning on the battlefield. He's not winning in Donbas. He's got to do something else, and doing these kinds, making these kinds of attacks and these kind of actions demonstrates his dilemma.
Now, Ukraine, I think, recognizes, and President Zelenskyy has said this, that he can't take the captured territory back by military means alone. So Ukraine is focusing on Russia's ability to continue to support the conflict, its economic underpinning of the conflict by attacking Russian oil and gas infrastructure, Russian manufacturing capability, creating havoc amongst Russian senior commanders by assassinating them in Moscow, and various other things. And as we're recording this, there's reports literally just popping up that another 4 tankers in the Black Sea that we're going to fill up with Russian crude oil and take it out have been attacked, and there've been explosions on them. No reports of any damage. But do you think Putin is actually starting to get really worried that his economy is about to be put in a very, very difficult position? And how long do you think he can last?
So his economy is in a difficult position for the reasons that you just said. That is, the sanctions that the Europeans and the Americans have put on effectively on the oil sector, the Russian oil sector. The Russians get the funds to prosecute this war from the sale of oil and gas overseas, the exports of oil and gas. And that's been constrained, not just by the oil price going down, but also by sanctions on places like India for buying tariffs that Donald Trump put on India for buying Russian oil, and the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft that have made it very difficult. That has had an effect. That has reduced the flow of revenue into the Russian treasury, which goes to the war machine, which keeps the war going. That's already having an effect. Down, some by estimates, like 30% down of what they're able to bring in terms of these revenues. So that's having an effect. And as you just pointed out, the Ukrainians are complementing these sanctions effectively, kinetically, by attacking these shadow ships. The Americans are attacking and boarding these shadow fleet that the Russians used to evade these sanctions. So this is having an effect, and that has to have an effect on the war. Who knows how long it will take? It's a good question, Philip, how long they can drag this out. But it is certainly having an effect. It's another indication to Putin that he cannot drag this out. He can't wait us out.
But as all this is going on, and the pressure that President Trump has been putting on Ukraine, but also putting pressure on Europe to actually stand up for once since the end of the Second World War and take its own defense seriously. As Europe begins to stand up and begins to provide more and more support into Ukraine, not relying on it coming directly from the United States, do you think it's coming to a position where actually the United States' role in supporting Ukraine is waning, and it'll get to a point where actually it's not as needed as people made it out to be whenever Russia carried out its full-scale invasion, almost 4 years ago now?
I think that's right. That's certainly the trend. 2 things are going on at the same time. The Europeans and the Ukrainians are building up their capacities. We've already talked about the Ukrainians' drone capacities, long-range drones, the attacks on military targets and energy targets, oil targets, shadow fleet. The Ukrainians are getting very good at that, and they are making a lot of what they use. They're making those drones. They are making, I understand, 50% of the weapons that they use on the battlefield today, 50% come from Ukrainian sources. That's up from 3% back in 2014. So this is an amazing increase in capability, defense industrial capability on the Ukrainians' part. And the Europeans are doing the same thing. So the Europeans and the Ukrainians are building up their capacities, not just defense industry, but also their weapons, the provision of weapons, and their political support for Ukraine. They're building all this up at the same time as they're trying to keep the Americans engaged. They're trying to keep President Trump on side for as long as possible. They know that the Americans, that President Trump is not going to be there forever. They understand that. The Europeans and the Ukrainians understand that. They want to continue to cooperate, work with, encourage Americans to be there and support the Ukrainians for as long as possible. And that continues. That continues along. There's, as you know, intelligence sharing that continues, the indirect supply of weapons, as you just indicated. The Europeans and the Ukrainians are buying weapons from U.S. sources, U.S. manufacturing. So that's continuing as long as possible, while the Ukrainians and the Europeans build up their own capabilities. So that both of those things are going on at the same time.
But at the same time, Vladimir Putin's global support base seems to be waning. He lost support from Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He'd invested an awful lot of military capability into supporting him. He's just lost the support that he had from Maduro in Venezuela. There are unconfirmed reports, and it's probably speculative reports, that the Chinese are considering options to land grab should Russia fall apart at some stage in the future, given the investment that they put in supporting Russia so far. And of course, we've got the growing situation that there is in Iran that is very difficult to work out exactly what's going on at the moment. But do you think Putin is beginning to feel more and more isolated as his coalition of the willing and wider BRICS members seem to be focused on their own issues, I think, at the moment is a better way of describing it?
I think you're right, Philip. And I think Putin's right to be worried. Putin's right to be uncomfortable. Yes, he's gotten weapons and ammunition from the North Koreans. He used to get something from Iran. As you indicate, that's not looking so good for him. He's lost other supporters and other sources of influence in Syria, as you say, and Venezuela. So yeah, Putin's looking isolated. He doesn't have great support from, whereas Ukrainians have continued support from Europeans in particular, but yes, also from the Americans. We're still there, as I say. We won't be there forever, I am sure, and no one wants us there forever. But for now, that support is coming, and that's got to be bothering Putin. That has got to be concerned about Putin as he sees his support fade, and he sees this support for Ukraine continue, even increase.
But at the same time, inside Ukraine, we've had the corruption scandal where President Zelenskyy lost his chief of staff, and he's just promoted General Budanov from the head of the GUR to be his new chief of staff. He's moving people around in his intelligence agencies. How much do you think that corruption scandal has hurt Zelenskyy? And how much do you think his reshuffling that's going on at the minute is going to strengthen his position or otherwise?
Philip, it is interesting. It is interesting. Maybe it's even ironic that the departure of Yermak, the chief of staff, has had the effect of boosting Zelenskyy and therefore Ukrainian strength, coherence, political support within the country. Andriy Yermak was very capable, very smart, worked very hard, was very loyal, but was very controversial, and is gone. And that has enabled, as you just said, General Budanov to come take that place and to focus on part of what Yermak used to do. And now Zelenskyy is looking to his prime minister, a very good prime minister, to do the domestic part, which is what prime ministers and the cabinet is supposed to do. They're supposed to do, but Andriy Yermak used to do that as well. This is to say that I think Zelenskyy is delegating more. He's got strong support in his own office now. You've mentioned General Budanov, but there's also Kyslytsya, Ambassador Kyslytsya, who was the ambassador to the UN for Ukraine. He's now the deputy. So they've got a very strong presidential office on the security side, and he is delegating more of the political action, domestic political questions, issues to his prime minister, as he should. So I think on net, President Zelenskyy is better off. Yes, that corruption is damaging. He's made the right decisions. Zelenskyy has said the right things about encouraging the investigation, getting rid of ministers who were implicated, cutting ties with a former business associate who I guess now is Israel anyway. So Zelenskyy is doing the right thing in terms of that investigation. He's he's moving the right people into the right positions that give him more strength. Certainly on the military side, security side, and delegating to the prime minister so she can do her job on the domestic political side.
But one of your roles as ambassador is giving the president of the United States an understanding of how the government is being run and what levels of corruption there are, and what are the pitfalls inside Ukraine. So you are probably as one of the better observers out there as to what's going on. There's an awful lot of accusations of corruption around what Zelenskyy is doing through the war, the Ukrainian government, and everything else. How corrupt is it?
So, Philip, as you know, all of the nations, all the countries that came out of, that emerged independent from the Soviet Union, have corruption problems. By far, the most corrupt nation in that part of the world, maybe anywhere, is Russia. Transparency International does a rating every year. And Ukraine has gotten better and better. That is less and less corrupt in the Transparency International ratings, whereas Russia continues to be near the bottom because Putin is the richest man in the world, having stolen from his country. So let's just be clear about the relative corruption, if you were. Number two, the Ukrainians have taken it very seriously. They have taken it very seriously. They've put in place anti-corruption institutions like no other nation in Europe, or no other nation in the world, I believe, that has this strong. When President Zelenskyy made a mistake this last summer in trying to reduce or take away the independence of those two main anti-corruption organizations that had been set up to ferret out corruption at very high levels, when he attempted to, and indeed got the Rada to pass a law taking away the independence of those two organizations, those two agencies, the country went crazy and demanded that he reverse himself, and which he did. Within 2 days, he reversed himself. Some people say this was a suggestion, another bad suggestion for Andriy Yermak. We don't really know. President Zelenskyy was, in the end, responsible for that decision, and he fixed it. He changed it. He pivoted. He passed got the Rada to pass another law to make those two agencies independent again, and they are doing the work. It's these two agencies that have identified the problem in the energy industry, in particular the nuclear and the protection, the defense of energy systems that is racking them right now, that caused the Yermak to depart and these other ministers to leave. It's those two agencies that are working. The message here is the Ukrainians know they have a problem. They've set up things there and set up organizations to counter and to go after that corruption. It's working. President Zelenskyy has been very, very clear that he fights corruption. Not only that, when I was there, he made a point of saying, listen, I'm not here to fight corruption. I'm here to eliminate corruption, to defeat corruption. Now, he's got a big job, as you just said. I mean, all those nations we all have problems. The Americans have problems. Maybe even the Brits have problems.
Believe me, we do.
And so what we have to do is deal with that, and we do deal with that, and the Ukrainians are too.
And the old saying is, Rome wasn't built in a day. But whilst Putin's got all of these problems that are going on, whilst President Zelensky's got all of these problems that's going on, whilst Europe is trying to get itself up to where it should have been decades ago, and put things together, it seems that President Trump is not averse to throwing the odd little complex issue into the international field, especially around Greenland. That seems to be undermining the real fabric of NATO and how NATO's held together. And this must be something that President Putin is sitting there. I often describe this as behind his big oak desk with a very large glass of best Russian vodka over ice with a big white cat on his knee as he's stroking it, going, yes, what's going on with Greenland?
Inexplicable. It makes no sense.
Good. I'm glad you said that.
I can't come up with any rationale. Everyone has it's been pointed out over and over and over that if Trump or the Americans want to have more support, more forces in Greenland and Denmark are happy to have it.
Yeah, well, the 1951 agreement allows it to happen anyway, so without even consultation with Denmark.
Absolutely. And there used to be 5 or maybe even 17. There were a lot of forces that had been in Greenland that could go back without, as you say, under an existing treaty. President Trump seems to say that there are all these Russian and Chinese ships that are surrounded. Well, no one can find them. No one can see these ships.
They're disguised as polar bears.
Polar bears. Yeah, I have no. And the other side of that is true that you just mentioned. That is, the alliance is important. Americans, we need allies. We need allies to do any of the things that we're talking about doing, in particular vis-a-vis Russia, but also vis-a-vis China, also vis-a-vis Iran. We need allies. So to gratuitously go after one of their best allies. Denmark has been a great ally from the beginning of NATO. To go after that makes no sense.
So, briefly, as we come to the end of our time, what do you think is going to happen through 2026? What are your predictions?
What I hope happens, Philip, is that what we talked about earlier continues. That is, Trump continues to understand, continues to get irritated, continues to recognize that Putin is playing him along. And that if Trump really wants to end this war, for whatever reason, I don't think there's a grand strategy there. I don't think there's an allegiance to the liberal international order. I don't think there's any of that. But what he does want to do, he wants to end the war. And he wants to get a prize for ending that war. That's fine. If he does want to get that prize, if he does want to end this war, he can put those sanctions, they can reinforce those sanctions on the Russian oil and gas sector. He can provide the Ukrainians with additional weapons that complements what they're already doing. He can support what the Europeans have done in terms of that $100 billion, 90 billion euro loan to keep the Ukrainians going. We can support that. We can go after that $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. There are things that President Trump can do in 2026 that he's thought about doing. He's thought about those sanctions. He's thought about going after that shadow fleet. He's thought about the tomahawks. He's thought about those 300 billion, or at least the 5 or 10 billion that's in the United States. There are things that he can do that he's considered that his administration is ready to do if he were to give the word. And once he realizes that that's what it's going to take, that's what it's going to take for him to do that, to win that prize, to end this war. I think that will happen this year.
Well, fantastic. Ambassador Taylor, I'm sure President Trump will be listening in to Times Radio Frontline. We hope he's an avid listener and watcher, so and he'll take on your advice. But thank you very much indeed for talking to me today on Times Radio Frontline.
He should be listening to you, Philip. He should be listening to you very carefully. But thanks for having me.